there's a way to make an entrance.
This is my destiny.
It was now a conspiracy of witches.
Download Veely today.
Any epoch will exhibit a dominant aesthetic or stylistic culture. And design history as a discipline uses style and the form of things as a way of investigating culture. The idea that a thing expresses something more than itself.
From the post-war modern style to the diversity of the new millennium, explore 6 decades of Canadian design.
The reason why design is important in Canada is because it is what defines us as a culture. It also defines us in our everyday world.
Delve into the collection of the Design Exchange, Canada's National Design Museum, to uncover the exceptional stories behind the objects of everyday life. These are the symbols of our cultural past and present. The 1960s were a time of social revolution and counterculture across the world. The affluence and materialism of the 1950s rolled over into the early days of the new decade. But the 60s soon became more about radicalism and change. People were looking for greater individual freedom. Youth culture grew, and conformity was swept aside in favor of eccentricity. This era was very much about looking to the future and breaking with the past. The space race was well underway, and with its first satellite, the Alouette, Canada joined along. By 1969, the United States had put a man on the moon. Within Canada and across the Western world, a myriad of social issues came to the surface. In Canada, the 1960s saw the Quiet Revolution in Quebec. The province was quickly modernizing, contributing to a burgeoning movement of Quebec nationalism. Unity became a predominant theme in the rest of Canada as the nation approached its centennial year. Design by Decade looks back to the 1960s to examine some of the most intriguing and original Canadian designs that represent this magical era.
The 1960s were globally a decade of radical transformation. You think of the 1960s in terms of counterculture, sexual liberation, civil rights movement, any number of dramatic social causes. The morality and ethics of the patriarchal governed suburbs were blasted apart by sons and daughters smoking marijuana, sitting in mud-stained fields, listening to Jimi Hendrix, who everyone knew was on drugs, burning their brassiers, and resisting Vietnam, which was supposed to be the war to put the stop to communism. So the 1960s had any number of effects across the world.
The 60s, it was a great time for Canada, a decade-long birthday party. 1967 was our centennial year, our 100th birthday. Montreal was selected to host the World Expo.
The 1960s is often seen as the decade when Canada came into its being. It saw the prime ministership of Lester B. Pearson be replaced by the remarkable telegenic bachelor, dashingly good-looking playboy, Pierre Elliott Trudeau. So Pierre Trudeau sort of embodies all of the potential, the transformative potential of the 1960s.
We should build, and we have to build, and we will build a strong and united country in which all Canadians will feel at home.
So striking if you consider that those children raised in those bucolic, often maligned suburbs, sitting around a dining table thinking about Leave It to Beaver and that type of white middle-class domesticity, become the children of protest in that decade of pluralism. As a result, aesthetically, the modernism of the 1950s has a direct connection to the countercultural aesthetic of the 1960s. The 60s sensibility takes modernism and plays with it. But what we see in the 60s, broadly speaking, is a transformed aesthetic from one of elite corporate-based culture to a more broad pop sensibility.
The 60s were a decade of fun. I mean, you can look at the cultural influences in North America and understand the design that's created from that time period, because it was the period of hippies and of free love and of exciting forward-thinking politics, you know, the embracing of liberalism. And I think that definitely translates into the design of the 60s, being more embracing of diversity, of different aesthetics. There was a great influence of sex on design, so that you saw a lot of sexually enticing products during the 60s. So it would have been a fun time.
One stellar example of stylish 60s Canadian design is the Project G stereo of 1963.
Stereos did not look like that ever before. And no subsequent stereo could ever match its radicalism or its elegance.
This stereo was made by the Clairtone Sound Corporation. Founded by Peter Monk and David Gilmour, two young Canadian entrepreneurs, Clairtone was in the vanguard of sophisticated design. Through their emphasis on innovation and their use of celebrity-infused advertising campaigns, Clairtone was a unique Canadian success story.
Founders Peter Monk and David Gilmour were very smart, and they knew how to work with the best designers, the best marketers, and really the best manufacturers that were available to them at that time.
I was 29 and David was 3 years younger. By definition, everything from the packaging to the advertising, from the design to the marketing, was our own innovation.
Peter Monk, President and Director of Engineering.
David Gilmour, Executive Vice President, Director of Styling and Merchandising.
The styling prior to Hugh Spencer's Project G was traditional and somewhat predictable. Cases that looked more like your grandmother's china hutch than a repository for advanced electronics. It was quite remarkable when Hugh Spencer was brought on board and was given the brief to design something. I think the phrase was way out.
We had a design department, and Hugh Spencer appeared. A bit of a nutcase. But you gotta be a nutcase to be so avant-garde. And he said, I got some great ideas. You guys can afford it. Will you hire me? So we did.
The Project G stereo absolutely captured the spirit of the 1960s as a type of swinging decade that was looser, less formal, hipper, chicer. As an object, the Project G embraced the space age and the idea of the rivalry between communism and capitalism. To evoke satellites orbiting the world in a stereo where you can be listening to jazz or Miles Davis or Oscar Peterson is quite a remarkable thing.
It's not only about the object, but also the branding that went along with the Project G. The branding is extremely sophisticated. I would say that it's probably the first incidence of lifestyle branding that we can see in Canada. It was used in Playboy magazine, it was used in the film The Graduate, it was photographed with Frank Sinatra and a lot of other great celebrities.
We were the kind of people at that age, you know, when you're 20, 30, 32, we moved around discotheques. So we met Oscar, and through Oscar we met Dizzy, and through Dizzy we met Hollywood, and from Hollywood we met Frank, and from there to Hugh Hefner, and they were all enthused. So I said, hey, come and help us.
It obviously has a very masculine design, okay, because of those gigantic globe ball speakers. And when they marketed the stereo, they marketed it as a phallic sound sculpture. After the Project G came the G2, and the G2 was actually a lot more sophisticated in design than the Project G. The speakers actually could be removed and detached from the stereo itself and plugged into a woofer. So it really anticipated componentry in stereos.
Second version pulls back a little bit. It's elegant, it's smaller, it has a thinner profile. It's a type of sort of Audrey Hepburn stereo. For Peter Monk to say to Hugh Spencer, design us a stereo for Clairtone that is way out, that will be like nothing we've ever seen before, would have been a wonderful challenge for Spencer, and one that we know he embraced, and one to which he rose remarkably.
without being conceited. I mean, Clairton was a bit of a unique Canadian achievement in the context of Canada in the late 50s or 60s. Canada was not known for avant-garde design, either mechanically nor electronically, and certainly not in aesthetic fields. We somehow rather broke that barrier, probably much more by luck and accident than by design or by talent. We suddenly became en vogue, we became fashionable. So it gave us a reputation somewhat internationally. We opened up, as you know, we opened up offices in London, we opened up offices in Frankfurt. That never happened to a Canadian product, never, never.
With the tremendously successful Project G stereo series, Clairton was recognized internationally as a company at the forefront of hip and progressive design. The sexy stereos truly embodied the swinging 60s. Despite the international acclaim in the world of home audio, Clairton hit some roadblocks with later products. The company shut its doors in 1972 after failed attempts to enter the color TV market. But its success with the Project G series created an unshakable legacy. The 1960s in Canada was a period of innovation and celebration. There was considerable investment in infrastructure and design during this time. New airports, schools, roads, and structures were built across the country. With the approach of Expo 67 in Montreal, a World's Fair that coincided with Canada's centennial year, the nation prepared for the world stage. There was elaborate construction for the event to make way for the various international pavilions. 62 nations participated, and it is generally recognized as the most successful World's Fair of the 20th century.
You know, some people think, when did we become a nation? Did we become a nation during Confederation? Did we become a nation at Vimy Ridge in World War I? Or did we become a nation at Expo 67? And some people argue, yes, it was Expo 67 because we look so good. This was a fantastic, well-organized World Fair. Everything was well designed, from the graphics to the fantastic pavilions. We had architects, young architects, coming to the stage for the first time. Arthur Erickson made his reputation there. Moshe Safdie made his reputation there. It's just a great example of Canadian design.
Canada, because of its relatively small population, because of its gigantic neighbor, existed, I think, in a lot of the world's imagination as a type of backward place. Expo, as a result, because it was celebrating 100 years of Canadian nationhood, was a fair that profiled Canada as a modern, sophisticated, progressive, adventuresome, aesthetically high-minded society. A type of humane World's Fair that was a birthday party that showed anyone who watched that Canada was a nation to be reckoned with.
Our national flag, which we now take for granted, but really our most well-known symbol, only came to being in 1964. Lester B. Pearson, the Prime Minister at the time, realized we've got to have a flag in time for Expo 67. I think it was very much a very successful example of a committee design.
The theme of Expo 67 was man and his world. Expo 67 took on the most progressive and humane qualities of counterculture by saying, we as a nation exist in a world of nations. If you think about the graphic design for Expo 67, you see these small stick men with their arms lifted up, holding what seems to be the earth. And these stick men surround this globe, and it becomes a wonderful representation of the purpose of Expo 67, namely that nations ideologically divided, at odds with one another, could come together in a spirit of global community, building pavilions showcasing national cultures, and yet doing so within the context of a World's Fair where everyone was welcome. Indeed, Canada opened its arms to the world, and the world came.
One of the most iconic projects that was created for Expo 67 is the Habitat 67 housing complex. Built along the St. Lawrence in Montreal, it was designed by the young architect Moshe Safdie. The idea behind Habitat was that it would serve the needs of the growing urban population by providing affordable housing in compact modular units. The spectacular complex contains 365 modules, connected together to produce 158 residences. These are now highly sought-after units that today are very costly.
Certain projects of architects that propel them to the world stage. Moshe Safdie's Habitat is one such project. It was his master's thesis at age 24 that was accepted as a project to be constructed at Expo 67.
Moshe Safdie's Habitat was world famous and is written about in every architectural publication of that time or any publication about 20th century architecture for sort of radicalizing our perceptions of multiple dwelling units.
If you think about the 1960s wanting to escape the rather rigid constructs of high modernism, curtain walls and black glass, Safdie's sort of jumble of cubes, looking sort of a mix between Lego and building blocks, captured the spirit of a new community and a new way of thinking about housing.
The Habitat 67 housing project was an incredible architectural experiment. But Habitat was also a pavilion at Expo 67. 12 suites were given over to design firms to create unique spaces for exhibit at Expo. Most of these involved Canadian designs being manufactured in Canada. Designers responsible for these suites included famed Canadian designer Jacques Guillaume, the inventive Hugh Spencer, American design firm Herman Miller, and many other prominent designers. 2 suites were designed by the Canadian firm Dudas Kuipers Rowan. Designer Jerry Adamson developed the area seating for DKR Suite, cube-shaped seating that was used both indoors as well as outdoors on the terraces. The chic Habitat chair was designed to correspond with the principles of Habitat 67. It was light, stackable, and modular. This was the first all-plastic chair produced in Canada. It remains representative not only of the remarkable Habitat housing project, but of the heyday of Expo itself.
As an aesthetic object, Adamson's chair evokes the pop sensibility of the 1960s. Plastic, a new material, around for decades, came into its full expressive use in this decade, with any number of designers exploring the sculptural and tensile capacities of the material.
There was a lot of advances happening in plastics because of what was happening with the aeronautic industries. Designers would then want to play with that material for the domestic markets. It's an example of rotational molding. It was new at the time. It was a cheap way to make an all-plastic chair, and essentially you just dump your polyethylene plastic parts into a big metal drum, and you heat it up, and that's your mold, and then you have your chair.
The design of the 1960s sees a type of rebellion. The sort of soft tones of the 1940s and 50s give rise in the 1960s to color. The palette becomes bright. Modernism becomes deeply shaded, vibrant new hues. With Adamson's chair, you find this modern object that is both high style but also low funk and fun. The chair was designed with the intent of being placed inside Moshe Safdie's Habitat. And in that sense, one has to appreciate the relationship between structures and objects that fill them. Even though you're living in what amounts to an apartment building, you're living in an individuated unit. And that might be the quintessential essence of the 1960s. One's an individual within society. And if you think about man and his world, you see the motif of Expo being repeated in Safdie's architecture and Jerry Adamson's chair.
The Habitat chair is a striking reminder of the momentous occasion of Expo 67. The nation's excellence in design truly shone at the 1967 World's Fair, and it changed the world's view of Canada. Many argue that 1967 was when Canadian nationalism reached its zenith. Social change and government investment helped Canada achieve new heights in design in the 1960s. Expo 67 conjured a strong sense of nationalism within the country, and Canada boasted its wares to the entire world. The era was truly a time of excellence in design. One ubiquitous and immediately recognizable object from the era is the Contemporary telephone. Designed in the centennial year and released in 1968, the telephone was successful both domestically as well as abroad. The Contemporary is an icon of modern Canadian design and was developed by the in-house team at Northern Electric. The Canadian company was founded in 1882 and produced a range of telecommunications equipment, including, eventually, consumer goods. Under the moniker of Northern Telecom and later Nortel, the company eventually became a global leader in telecommunication systems until its bankruptcy in 2009.
Northern Electric became the manufacturing arm of the telephone industry in Canada. They were making the nuts and bolts, the casings, and they created this incredible design team that was led by John Tyson.
Tyson's phone was transformative because of its flat, sleek profile. It was a phone for modern people, for individuals who wanted to have a stylish interior. If phones used to be black, now they could be orange or vibrant red. If phones used to be rather clunky, now they could be sleek and streamlined. Tyson wanted to create a modern, new-looking telephone, and in doing so, took a rectangle and placed the handset within the box. First Canadian designed and Canadian made phone. It sold 7,000 units a week for any number of years. As a result, I think it is iconic insofar as it's a phone that people readily identify and think, oh, I know that phone. I lived with that phone. That phone was my modern telephone. That's a testament to Tyson's forward design thinking.
I think that for Northern Telecom, it's a good story. It's a great design story.
It was a great example of Canadian design and manufacturing. We look at a lot of Canadian designers where the designers are brought in or they're doing their products on spec, but here's an example of a corporate design team that was revolutionizing and transforming a company through design, but was also in-house. And that's a very American tradition, and I think it was an important stepping stone for Canadian design and industry.
The Contemporary telephone remains a relic of the glory days of Northern Electric. The success of remarkable companies such as Clairtone and Northern Electric in the 1960s is integral to understanding Canada's contribution to the world of design. This period was a real pinnacle of Canadian design and continues to evoke national pride.